In 1973, the average cost of a single family home in the United States compared to the typical median household income at the time was around 3.5 times. That figure has now ballooned to 7.5, which is higher than what it was just a couple of years before the housing bubble collapsed.
I know this data is from the US. It's very similar experiences in other countries, but I'd recognize this pattern in the UK. Um, I think some countries experiences swings, the volatility a little bit higher. So the US tends to, I think, have higher volatility. So the downswing following the financial crisis in 2008, arguably a little bit more severe. And therefore the sort of climb back. But that reversion to the previous trajectory that we've seen since the late 90s is something I definitely recognize.
So I'm going to be honest, before interviewing Professor Ed, I was hoping that the reason why housing prices have gone through the roof is because of, a simple reason, blame the boomers. That's it. It turns out housing is a very complicated good. Every country, city, village will have their own reasons why prices have gone up. One of the main reasons is that housing is a very long-term product. It's the biggest purchase people make in their life. It's not like tomatoes or chocolate. If there is a spike in demand, it takes a while for governments and suppliers to plan for housing, build the houses and homes, and then for people to move into these houses and homes. It can take years to decades.
Those chains of transactions take quite a long time to work their way through any particular market. You buy a house, you're not just buying the bricks or the mortar or the roof over your head, you're buying access to amenities, access to services, access to labor markets, you're buying neighbors. So it's a really complex commodity.
In reality, there's a lot of factors that affect supply, demand, or both that's currently driving the price of housing up and affordability down. And one contributing factor is that in many markets, the number of people living per household is going down.
Of course, as the average household size reduces and population stays the same or increases, obviously that increases the demand for housing units. And so that will have a long run impact on house prices.
Socially, there's been a change in the way we want to live. Take my example. My grandparents lived with us until they passed away. My granddad passed away when I was 3, and my grandma lived with us all the way until I was in high school. The norm is that a household would contain multiple generations, grandparents, parents, and their kids. But now the tendency is to move away and establish your own household that's focused only on the parents and the kids, which of course would increase demand, raising the price.
The kind of more Western approach to nuclear families living in their own homes has sort of started to trickle into other societies as well and driven up the demand for housing. That is basically, not so much focused on the kind of multi-generational household, but this kind of single nuclear family unit.
But if house prices are going up and ownership rate is not really changing that much, that means someone is buying those houses. So what is going on? The issue with the chart that I showed in the beginning part of the video, it's a very popular chart. Anytime housing affordability is mentioned, it comes up. The problem with that chart is that it shows affordability for those who are smack dab in the middle. In recent decades, the increasing income and wealth inequality made it harder for the poor and those who have unstable sources of income to afford a home.
But what's really been damaging is, particularly for those on lower incomes in many societies like the UK, the US, has been the move towards more precarious forms of employment. So sometimes we call it in the UK the gig economy. So you kind of have to hustle in a sense. You may be an Uber driver, or you may be delivering food using a kind of platform economy model, and you don't know where your next paycheck's coming from. And lenders in the housing market really don't like that. Yeah, they like salaried people. They like people that have got permanent jobs. And so I think as as those that have higher salaries don't just have higher salaries, they tend to have better job security. Lenders like job security, and therefore the rates that lenders will charge, so how they price their mortgage products, varies according not only to your income but to the stability of your employment.
Here is another issue. Whenever you see a screenshot like this, or this, you tend to think that this is just absolutely going crazy. The problem is not every place is that unaffordable. Governments, for some reason, are still focusing a lot on economic hubs. New York, London, Tokyo, things like that. And that's creating an increase in demand in places where the supply is very small.
I think governments can do quite a lot, which they tend not to. They tend to be a bit squeamish about trying to redistribute the economy, the underlying economy. They tend to sort of really want to back their strong cities. So London gets a disproportionate amount of investment. The argument being it's the number one city in the UK. It drives very much the global economy in many ways. It's really important to protect. So it's got to be invested in. But if that is to the disbenefit of other cities that are not getting the same share of investment in things like transportation or just investment in local services or investment in strategies that can help create jobs, like investment in universities, for example, or innovation, then you're not doing anything to benefit the housing market. You're just going to overheat some part of the country. Whereas if you could take the heat out of it and spread it around, that I think helps. So I think the one thing that seems to me that governments don't tend to take seriously is the idea that the housing market is very much a reflection of the economy as well.
Then you've got the fact that over the past few decades, housing has become much more important when it comes to growing investments. It's always been the case, but typically, if you want to buy a home as an individual, like Professor Ed mentioned, you'd consider many factors, location, amenities, services, plus the fact that it's an investment that's going to grow over time. For investment brokers and hedge fund managers, institutional buyers, it's only the latter that matters, which can cause problems depending on where you'd like to buy a home.
But I think what we've seen, certainly over the last 40 years, possibly longer in countries like the United States, is that housing has become more of an investment. So the investment function of housing has become more important than just its shelter function. And so that means it responds to macroeconomic conditions in a slightly different way than it might have done, sort of going back to the earlier half of the 20th century, for example.
Institutional buyers, unlike you and me, they can buy off a large enough part of a market and they can corner that market and influence the price to be higher than what it would otherwise be at. In late 2023, US Congress introduced a bill that would require hedge funds and corporations to completely sell off any single-family homes they own within 10 years. The congressman who introduced this bill cited data from the Urban Institute where in 2011, no single entity owned more than 1,000 single-family homes. And by June 2022, that figure was 574,000 single-family homes owned by hedge funds and corporations. The bill hasn't passed, but as you can see, it can be an issue. Depending on your city or country, institutional buyers might be a contributing factor for why prices have gone up. There's another thing that's affecting this ratio as well, and that's the fact that people are living longer and retiring later. Lenders have been happy to grant 30, 35, and even 40-year mortgages, and buyers have this expectation that they can afford more expensive houses because they could just pay it off over a longer period of time. And suppliers, knowing this, they do exactly that. They raise the price. Thank you very much for watching, and for a more in-depth discussion on this topic, please check out the full interview with Professor Ed Ferrari in the description.